Hello and welcome to Tuesday in Parliament. On this programme, what's the future looking like for US-UK relations? Boris Johnson comes in for some mockery towards his new policy towards Donald Trump.
The Foreign Secretary, in the space of the last few weeks, has gone from not going to New York in case he's mistaken for Mr. Trump to saying he's the opportunity for the Western world.
Bored by Brexit? Not a bit of it, says a former Cabinet Secretary.
I think this is a terrific opportunity for the civil service, I haven't often, since I retired, wanted to be back in the civil service, but I do now.
And MPs return to the debate over selection in education.
We take the children at quite a young age that we think are going to be the most talented musicians and we give them elite special training so that they can play to the highest standards in the world.
But first, a fortnight is a long time in international politics. It's only 2 weeks since the voters of the United States chose their 45th president. Donald Trump's victory has prompted a huge volume of comment and reaction. As he's slowly assembled his new team, the speculation has been intense over what his presidency means for America's relations with the rest of the world, not least with the United Kingdom. Donald Trump tweeted that UKIP's Nigel Farage would be an ideal choice to be Britain's next ambassador to the US, a comment that made for some interesting exchanges at Foreign Office questions, starting with a former Conservative minister well known for his support for the unsuccessful Democrat candidate Hillary Clinton.
Sir Simon Burns.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Although there is no vacancy, would the Foreign Secretary think that it's extremely generous of Donald Trump to suggest who should be our ambassador in the United States? And in that measure of fraternity, might he suggest that the best person to fill the vacancy for the ambassador to the United Kingdom next year would be Hillary Rodham Clinton? Though I suspect the last thing she'd want to do is be associated with the incoming administration.
I think the right honourable gentleman might want to be the ambassador to the United States. Foreign Secretary.
Well, all right, Mr. Speaker, you anticipate what I was about to say, because of course, my right honourable friend would be a very good candidate. On the other hand, as the House knows full well, we have a first-rate ambassador in Washington doing a very good job of relating both with the present administration and the administration-to-be, and there is no vacancy for that position.
Diplomats require diplomacy, and wouldn't my right honourable friend agree with me that there should be no place for anyone who expresses inflammatory and what sometimes could be considered to be bordering on racist views in representing this country in discussions with the United States?
Secretary. I'm grateful to my honourable friend, and I think he catches the mood of the House, Mr. Speaker, and I think we've already settled that question. We have an excellent ambassador in Washington doing a first-rate job, and there is no vacancy.
I think we are all relieved that the Foreign Secretary has ruled out Mr. Farage. In this post-truth world, we might have assumed that he might have been sympathetic, given they had campaigned together so remarkably on Brexit. But can the Foreign Secretary perhaps outline to the House his thinking in terms of what he is going to say when he visits the United States of America about our future relations, given that we have always been the conduit between Europe and the United States of America?
I think my honourable friend asks a thoughtful question and a very important question, because it is vital that we get our message over about as I've said to the member opposite, the vital importance of NATO, of free trade and free enterprise, and of the sticking up for the values that I believe unite our two countries. And that is the message that I know that the Prime Minister will be getting across when she goes there, and certainly it's the message that we will be delivering at all levels from the UK government.
Mr. Speaker, as we meet today on the 53rd anniversary of John F. Kennedy's death, we have the prospect of a very different president about to enter the White House in just a matter of weeks. Nevertheless, the Secretary of State said last week, and he has said again today, that this new president is, I quote, a liberal guy with whom he shares many values. And it doesn't end there. We have, he tells us, and I quote again, every reason to be positive about a Trump presidency. So can the Secretary of State tell us what reasons there are to be positive on the attitude of the new president to the issue of climate change?
Secretary.
I think it's vital that we are as positive as we can possibly be about the new administration elect. And as I've said before to the House, I believe that the UK-US administration relationship is of vital importance. I think that President-elect Trump is a deal maker. And when it comes to climate change, this is something that the UK has led on globally. We have had outstanding success. And yes, I'm very open with the House. It is a message we will be taking to the administration that we believe it to be important. We believe it to be in the interests of the United States and of the world.
Emily Thornberry.
Mr. Speaker, the reality is that we have a new president who says that climate change is a hoax invented by the Chinese, who has repeatedly promised to scrap the Paris Treaty. A president whose top advisor on the environment calls global warming nothing to worry about. And there is no doubt that this is a hugely dangerous development for the future of our planet. So let me ask the Secretary of State, when the Prime Minister goes to see the new president in January, will she have the moral backbone to tell him that he is wrong on climate change and that he must not scrap the Paris Treaty? And will she lead the world in condemning him if he does?
Secretary.
I really must say to the Right Honourable Lady that I believe she's being premature in her hostile judgments of the administration-elect, and any such premature verdict, I believe, could be damaging to the interests of this country.
Sir Alex Salmond.
The Foreign Secretary, in the space of the last few weeks, has gone from not going to New York in case he's mistaken for Mr. Trump to saying he's the opportunity for the Western world, which is a political pirouette of which Ed Balls would be proud. So, can the Foreign Secretary realise what we're dealing with in the new President of the United States? And wouldn't this country's policy be helped by coherence, consistency and a bit of common sense?
Secretary.
I think that what the world needs now is the UK to build on its relations with the United States, which is, I think most people in this House would accept, are of fundamental importance for our security. And as I've said very candidly to honourable members, those are the 3 essential points that we will be making to our friends. The vital importance of the transatlantic alliance of NATO, the importance of free trade and free enterprise, and of jointly promulgating the values that unite our two countries. That is the message.
Boris Johnson. A former head of the civil service, Lord Kerslake, has warned that there aren't enough civil servants to cope with the demands of the UK leaving the European Union. His remarks follow a leaked memo last week from the consultants Deloitte, which said the civil service would have to recruit an extra 30,000 personnel to deliver Brexit. The Prime Minister's official spokesman said the consultant who wrote the memo had not been working for the government.
How much do you think the government is making an increasingly impossible ask of particularly departments in the present climate, with reducing the civil service but overlaying more and more tasks and now Brexit?
Well, I think you have raised the big issue here, really, and I think in my personal view there is a genuine issue about capacity to manage both the demands of Brexit, which is huge, complex, and where there are big stakes, and at the same time taking forward a set of other policy initiatives that government want to take. I think it's not possible to do that at a point where the civil service is at its lowest numbers since the Second World War and continuing to fall.
Another former senior civil servant was enthused by the whole thing.
The task facing the government and facing the civil service is definitely huge. We shall have to run domestically policies that have been previously run by Brussels. If we leave the customs union, we'll need an awful lot more people on the borders. However, I don't think that should stop making the efficiencies in other areas which the government is set out to make. I think there probably will be a net increase in the size of the civil service as a result of this, and the government ought first of all to look to redeploying people, but they shouldn't stop trying to make efficiencies which are possible.
No, I entirely agree.
Lord Buckley remarked that the civil service helped win the Second World War, and of course that is very reassuring, but there is something about the civil service in peacetime that lacks the same pace and urgency that the civil service has demonstrated in wartime. How should ministers inculcate that sense of pace and urgency?
I think this is a terrific opportunity for the civil service, and I haven't often since I retired wanted to be back in the civil service, but I do now, because I think that this is a very exciting time, and I think there's an opportunity to rise to it, and I am confident that on past form the civil service will.
The civil service was in excess of 1 million in 1944. In 2016 it's 392,000, so we've seen a drastic change in its size and composition. The second point I'd make is that of course the civil service should carry on seeking to be more efficient, but what we've really got to resist is letting good people go and then finding we recruit back at huge cost.
Some thoughts on Brexit. Meanwhile, the House of Lords has held a general debate on different aspects of Britain's EU departure. The Prime Minister has maintained Britain will get the best exit deal so long as the government doesn't provide a running commentary on its negotiating strategy. But some of her opponents say the policy is too secretive. A Conservative peer said keeping all your cards close to your chest isn't always the right tactic.
But it's not always wise to clutch all your cards close to your chest. Occasionally you need to play one to draw other cards out. And the whole process of negotiation, in my view, is one of creating a favourable atmosphere by gradually exposing your hand. And if in doing that you have the express endorsement of a sovereign parliament at your back, you'll be much stronger in your negotiating position.
I do not believe that, given the magnitude of the matters which are to be decided in this Brexit issue, that it could be right that Parliament has no involvement until the end of the negotiating process, or that its role should be reduced to merely debating the situation and asking questions in a vacuum.
And I do think the government should come clean before they make up their mind. I think the government should be telling the country what the choices are, what are the upsides and the downsides of the various options.
Lord Inglewood said that Brexit will be a long, drawn-out process. It's going to take, my lords, 2 to 10 years. The elements of this are not as simple as exiting the European Union. What about the treaties, whether it's staying in the single market or staying in the customs union, doing trade deals?
Now, when Britain goes, the pressure will move to Berlin. Berlin will no longer be able to stand in the centre. It will have to take a much stronger role, and a role which, let me tell you, having recently been there, is not one that they are looking forward to taking. They, unlike us, we can take a strong role, and the worst they'll say is, oh, the Brits throwing their weight around. If Germany tries to take a strong role, it brings out all the animus of years ago, and that's why the Germans don't like it, and that's why the Germans are very unhappy at us leaving, because we have been the sensible people who have helped to deliver a European Union that works.
Why is it that the government have been so desperately anxious to cut Parliament out of the loop over Article 50? Nobody has given an explanation of that. The public is entitled to know, and the proceeding is quite extraordinary. And I hope we won't be told that it's in order to save time, because it really would be the most terrible insult to Parliament to be told that to consult Parliament is a waste of time. And anyway, it would be an untrue explanation, because the government now, by appealing the decision of the High Court, have lost more time, perhaps 6 or 7 weeks at least of time, precisely in order to be able to prevent Parliament from getting in on the action.
You're watching our roundup of the day in the Commons and the Lords. Still to come, a plea for better financial help for people who donate organs. A strong defence of selection in education has been mounted in the Commons by a former Cabinet Minister. In the latest debate on social mobility, John Redwood told the House it was perfectly normal for talented musicians or footballers to be selected. So why couldn't the principle be applied to academic abilities?
If a young person from a poor background becomes a top footballer, that is a transformational event in their lives, and good luck to them. And why do they not understand that exactly the same arguments apply to art and to ballet and to music? We take the children at quite a young age that we think are going to be the most talented musicians, and we give them elite special training so that they can play to the highest standards in the world. I give way.
For giving way, and I'm glad he mentioned football, because actually 13% of our national football team went to a private school, which is double the number of people who go to school, those private schools nationally. Does he think that might account for the performance of our national football team if we're missing out on the talent that exists in the comprehensive sector? And will he recognise that that is precisely the problem that we're looking at today? We're missing out on talent as a result of too narrow a focus.
Speaker, I don't think we're going to get a better team by training them less and no longer giving them any kind of elite education. I really think they're being very obtuse on the benches opposite.
By the time that they would take the 11+, children from the most disadvantaged backgrounds are already on average 10 months behind. The evidence shows that investment in early years is the best way to close the attainment gap between the most disadvantaged children and their affluent peers.
The Honourable Lady give way. Happily give way. Does the Honourable Lady agree with David Cameron, who said there's a kind of hopelessness about the demand to bring back grammars, an assumption that this country will only ever be able to offer decent education to a select few?
Yeah. I thank the honourable member for her contribution, and I find myself agreeing with the former Prime Minister, who was obviously elected to make those contributions within this debate, and that's the platform and the manifesto that the Conservative government stood on that they're currently rejecting.
I was setting out why this government believes that driving social mobility matters so much, but I also wanted to set out that in reality, as challenging as it is for our country, there is no country in this world that has managed to crack the issue of social mobility yet. That is because it's highly complex, it has many factors that feed into it, and it's because improving social mobility is, as the Social Mobility Commission says, a long-term issue which needs a long-term approach and not to be simply treated like a political football for short-term political gain.
If we are serious, and if the government is serious in believing that more selective schools raises standards across the board, then they would have proposed only introducing those schools in pilot areas and those areas of underperformance. But the Green Paper talks about local demand being a driver. And my question to the ministers is, what if those areas most in need of standards being raised opt out of having new schools?
The real problem with selective education is not that you end up with good schools and poorer schools. It's not that one set of teachers works harder than another. It's that whole swathes of our young people will be labelled, wrongly of course, as having failed. And with that, social mobility falls.
Let's open up opportunities to people regardless of their ability to pay, and that's exactly what we do in those areas that offer selection in the state sector. But Trafford is outstanding, Mr. Speaker, not just because of its 7 grammar schools. It's also the outstanding quality of the high schools, and this persistent myth from the 1950s and 60s that if you have grammar schools you have sink schools is an utter nonsense and should be rejected.
In selective areas, the concern is that non-selective schools
do worse because the selective schools have in some sense creamed off the best pupils. And I think there is not clear evidence for that. There are reports on both sides giving both points of view. The Sutton Trust, on both sides, the Sutton Trust in 2008 found no such effect.
I could take members of this House to the grammar schools in Sutton next to my constituency, and I will show you classes of young Tamil kids, first and second generation, on free school meals. There, because their parents understand the importance of education and they live the immigrant's dream, which many members in this House have shared and benefited from. But it's our own white working class kids who are not getting the benefit of that, and the issue, I would suggest, is so much bigger than the type of school.
There's been a significant misinformation put out there about the achievement in the education system in Kent. Children in Kent achieve above national average in their GCSEs. The system does well, and we know that particularly within that system, children on low incomes, children on free school meals or in seater pupil premium are doing especially well in our grammar schools that enable those children to make up the gap between themselves and other children with greater advantages.
The ongoing debate on social mobility. The main focus of attention at Westminster this week is the autumn statement, which will be delivered for the first time by the Chancellor Philip Hammond. More often than not, in budget speeches and autumn statements, there are announcements concerning additional money for the health service. So, by way of a precursor to the autumn statement, MPs have been arguing over the state of the NHS finances and what's needed for the future.
Public health budgets, which fund projects to tackle teenage pregnancy, anti-smoking interventions, alcohol consumption, sexually transmitted disease infections. This public health budget will have been cut by 9.7% by the end of this Parliament. A completely false economy leading to greater demands on the acute sector. And of course, we all know, as my honourable friend, the member for Worsley, so brilliantly outlined last week, the adult social care budget has been slashed, and he is on the brink of something. I'll give way to the member for Chelmsford.
I'm extremely grateful, gentlemen. I think the House would take him somewhat more seriously if he did point out that by 2019-20, the real terms increase in spending on the health service will be £10 billion. And during the last election, his party only promised to increase spending in this Parliament by a quarter of that, £2.5 billion.
Well, gentlemen, the Right Honourable Gentleman was the Minister who took the Health and Social Care Act through this Parliament, which wasted £3 billion on an unnecessary top-down order. He should be apologising to the House, not making those comments. Now, I want to make a little bit of progress. We are seeing unprecedented cuts to social care. That has meant that the numbers of people aged over 65 accessing publicly funded social care will fall by 26%.
Does he agree with me that when funding is cut, then our hospitals seek to raise cash in other ways, like the unacceptable level of car parking charges in our hospital, charges which the government promised before the last election to clamp down on?
As we have the Leader of the Opposition here, he said, the King's Fund said, claims of mass privatisation were and are exaggerated. So let's not go chasing down rabbit holes. But the result of this government's commitment to the NHS is that real term spending per head has gone up by 4.6%. That is double the rate of Scotland, 3 times the rate of Wales. And he also mentioned the National Audit Office. What he didn't mention about the numbers quoted in the NAO report was they are last year's figures, and what he chose not to mention was this year's numbers, published last week, which show 40 fewer trusts in deficit. Yes, a year ago, half of trusts were missing their financial plans, but now 86% of trusts are hitting their financial plans.
A Labour MP says organ donors should be guaranteed the right to paid leave so they can recover from operations without losing out at work. Louise Haigh introduced a bill in the Commons under the 10-minute rule. It would bring in statutory leave for donors. She said the lack of any legislation was holding back potential donors.
For young people in particular who have the highest likelihood of donating high-quality bone marrow, that time out of the workplace may completely deter you. So that's why my bill will guarantee living organ donors the right to paid time off
to allow them to recover, safe in the knowledge that they will not be financially penalised and that their job will be waiting for them when they return. These guarantees will not only bring peace of mind, but will help increase the number of living donors from 1,000 and bridge the gap between availability and need. But crucially, it will send a clear signal from government and from this House that if you are prepared to give an organ to save a life, the law will back you every step of the way.
Anne Louise Haig's bill got the initial approval of the Commons but is unlikely to become law in its present form. Well, that's it for this programme. Do join me for our next Daily Roundup. Until then, from me, Keith McDougall, goodbye.